On today's World Insight with Tin Wei, Turkey's missile order from Russia, signed, sealed, and about to be delivered. A deal breaker with the US and NATO. And the advent of the cashless age. What do you get from the combination of a social network giant and cryptocurrency? Here's our host, Tin Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with Russia's missile delivery to Turkey. Recently, Turkey cautioned the United States after the U.S. said Ankara would face real and negative consequences for acquiring the advanced Russian-made S-400 air defense missiles. They are now on their way to Turkey. Take a look.
Relations between the U.S. and Turkey have been strained for some time, but these Russian-made missiles are making them worse. The two NATO allies are on a collision course with Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system, reportedly worth $2.5 billion. On Monday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan confirmed that the missile shipment was proceeding as planned. The controversial deal has become a big irritant with Washington. The U.S. warned Ankara would face real and negative consequences for buying the Russian missile system, including economic sanctions and removal from the supply chain for F-35 jets. Former U.S. Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan warned that Turkish defense companies would be thrown out of the F-35 fighter jet program, losing billions of dollars in contracts. With a struggling economy, a billion-dollar contract might be hard for Turkey to ignore. Despite mounting diplomatic pressure and Washington's warnings, the Turkish president stands firm.
Now, I believe eyes are on the delivery process of this issue, but there are no setbacks in our agreements. We hope for this to be beneficial to our country, our region, and the world.
The arrival of the S-400 is expected to trigger sanctions from Washington under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. The U.S. has already halted the F-35 training of Turkish pilots. Mr. Erdogan did receive some words of support from U.S. President Donald Trump during the G20 summit last month in Japan. As Turkey turns away from the West for its defense needs, could the two countries avert a crisis that risks unraveling the NATO alliance?
Turkey's purchase of Russian missile system, what does it mean for everyone? In Moscow, we have Alexander Lukin, Professor and Director, East Asian and SCO Studies, Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Also, we have in Moscow, originally from the United States, William Courtney, Adjunct Senior Fellow of the RAND Cooperation. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen, to our program. To you, Professor Lukin, is it a good deal for Russia?
No, of course it's a good deal, because Russia is selling its most advanced weapons to a country which is a NATO member for the first time in history, and this means that they recognize that Russian weapons this weapon system specifically is probably the best in the world. And the price is good, and Russia gets some revenue for that, so surely it's good.
Professor Lukin, just to follow up briefly from you as well, is it going to compromise the NATO defense system as the Americans have been worrying about, Professor Lukin?
Well, I'm not sure if it's going to compromise anything, but it's not for Russia to think about it. The Americans are saying that it will, but I think it's just what we are really looking at is competition in arms trade, because their systems are much more expensive, and they want to impose it on everybody under the banner of alliance relations. But Turkey their relations with Turkey are not that great at the moment, and probably Turkey wants to show some kind of autonomy by that. But anyway, it's just speculation, because Russia is, you know, you want Russian weapons and we are selling it, so that's as simple as that. We don't have to think about some strategic plans or strategic
I see.
ideas.
However, Washington probably has to think about that. Does it, Mr. Courtney?
Yes, certainly, because Turkey is a NATO member, has been a long-standing, a very important part of the NATO alliance. The United States certainly hopes that that relationship continues. As Professor Lukin points out, the Russian S-400 system is less expensive than the U.S. Patriot system, and the S-400 is a capable system. But this doesn't seem to be the main purpose why President Erdogan is buying the S-400. He seems to be wanting to take Turkey in a more autarkic direction, if you will, loosening ties with NATO, having better ties with Russia, and playing a greater role in the Middle East. But there's a question whether Erdogan is pushing too many fronts too fast. The humiliating loss in the Istanbul mayoral election recently is a reminder that President Erdogan has to be careful politically at home.
But on the other hand, Mr. Courtney, many wonder, is the United States losing at least this round of competition, using the word, borrowing from Professor Lukin earlier, in terms of price, in terms of function, in terms of the geopolitics balance? It seems that Russia is having an upper hand, at least in selling, managed to sell this time, missiles to Turkey. Is it?
Well, in this particular case, Russia is selling the S-400 to Turkey, so that is a setback. But from Turkey's defense standpoint, the S-400 will be much less useful for Turkey than buying the Patriot, because it will not be integrated with the other NATO-compliant parts of Turkey's defense system. So that's going to be a real problem for Turkey. And then secondly, with the S-400 personnel there from Russia, there's a risk of compromise of Turkey's security, and that should be another concern for Ankara.
Professor Lukin, you want to respond to that? The Russians might be undermining the security of Turkey.
Well, I think that the Turkish government is quite competent in deciding whether some purchase of some weapon system undermines its security system or defense system or not. It's not for Americans to decide. I think that what Americans are saying here is, as I said, just a competition. They want to sell more expensive weapons to everyone under the ban of under the ban of alliance relationship and under, well, they're doing the same with gas in Europe, for example, natural gas. They want Europeans to buy their own natural gas, which is more expensive than Russian, and the excuse is that Russia is a bad country and America is a very good country.
Right. Mr. Courtney,
but you cannot actually play on that.
Okay, Mr. Courtney.
Play on that all the time. You have to be more effective.
Well, that's probably the question. Mr. Courtney, is America being effective now, bringing everybody together still on the platform of NATO? Obviously, Turkey is having something in mind now, trying to play a balanced game, at least geopolitically. But many wonder whether that is only the first. There will be more to come, even with the issue of NATO security, Mr. Courtney.
Well, the Turkish geopolitical situation is really quite complicated, and so is America's interest in Turkey. For example, the U.S. has an air base in eastern Turkey at Incirlik, which is one of the most important overseas U.S. military bases in the world. There may be some alternatives if, for example, Incirlik were closed down. There may be some alternatives elsewhere in the Middle East, but that's an important consideration. There are some new developments with regard to Greece. Greece has had a new election. The Greek government is probably going to have, the new Greek government probably have better relations with the West and the United States than the one before. So Turkey would not want to cut itself off from NATO too much and leave Greece in a position, stronger position in NATO. So that's a consideration. So all the way around, it's really complicated. There's no easy solution for anyone that does not involve trade-offs.
Talking about Turkey, our Turkish guest appear in Ankara. We have Çalhakoglu, who is the director of the Turkish Center for Asia-Pacific Studies. So what a pleasure seeing you, sir, once again on the program. Tell us to understand what is the sophisticated thinking process, or not, in Turkey about this recent decision, despite of the strong opposition you have seen from Washington. Do we have our Turkish guest hearing our questions? Mr. Çalhakoglu?
Yeah, me. Okay, so I got your question.
Thank you, sir.
In that regard, we can say that now Turkey is in the critical juncture to decide to purchase a Russian system. It is identified as an enemy system for NATO system in that sense. So of course, when we look at the Turkey's explanation for that, this is just because of the need. Turkey could not purchase American system or other NATO systems previously. So that's why Turkey is purchasing the Russian system right now. But on the other, of course, there are some strategic and political reasons for Turkey's purchasing for this new air defense system from Russia. So in Ankara, particularly since 2016, there is a rise of the Eurasianism or anti-West sentiment in general. So some security bureaucracy considers these system change or the purchasing very critical defense system from Russia as a orientation change in that regard. So they are considering that this is new seeking for balancing for Turkey against the West in that sense. But on the others, when we look at the Turkey's relations with the United States and other NATO countries and of course with the European Union, so Turkey has a very deep-rooted engagement for decades with NATO and NATO allies in general. So then it is a very critical decision right now. There is a decision to create an alternative for NATO systems on the one hand. On the other, there are long-term dependency to NATO systems. So then now the Turkish government has faced many challenges need to address for that. So we are waiting the details for this purchase, and also we are waiting the response if there is from the United States.
What do you mean by details of this purchase? Exactly what are the details are you looking for?
Actually, from the beginning, there is no detail for the purchase for example, for S-100 since late 2017. The amount of the deal, so there are some rumors only. The main believe that it is around 2.5 billion US dollars. But on the other, the deployment of the place in Turkey, there are lots of rumors for that in Ankara or in Southeast or Mediterranean coast of Turkey. And also Turkey's main goal for deployment of the Russian systems in general. So there are lots of sayings and rumors without clear notification and also information to the public. So there is not very clear certainty for that. On the other, Turkey is still deploying the NATO's Patriot systems in the southeast against any potential attack from Syria or Syrian side in that manner. So then it is very complicated right now. The Turkey's defense engagements for fighter jets and others on the one hand, and also new Russian system wants to apply to the Turkish defense system, air defense system right now.
Well
so
explained.
there are lots of conflicting issues and arguments together. So there is no credible picture or clear picture right now.
One of the things people talk about, Mr. Çalhakoglu, in Turkey is where the battery will be for the S-400. Some media reports suggest it will be in Ankara, at least the one battery. Others say, well, it's not necessarily confirmed, as you just earlier explained. Now, you probably want to explain to our viewers as to why is it that significant as to one battery in Ankara or not? Why is it such an issue for those that are in the defense area? Mr. Çalhakoglu, you want to explain briefly?
Yeah, sure. Also, there is no clear explanation from the Turkish officials, so that it is highly likely that if there is a delivery from Russia, it will be deployed in Ankara. This is the expectation. Next to capital Ankara, there is an air base, namely Akıncı, so then it will be deployed there. But on the other, during the process, also Turkish government officials delivered different statements for the deployment for that. For example, only deploying for eastern part. For Turkey's defense minister Hulusi Akar also said in that direction in previous weeks and months. For the eastern part of Turkey, not western part of Turkey. Some says also only for defending for big cities. And also there was another claim it will be deployed for Russian nuclear power plant in Turkey, in southern part of Turkey, namely Mersin area, to protect the Akkuyu nuclear power plant for that. So still there is no clear explanation for that, but the expectation the deployment will be possibly carried out in Ankara, basically.
Right. Now, we are leaving the rest of the 2 minutes to our guests from Russia and the U.S. If things continue to boil, are we going to see the bilateral relations already strained between Washington and Moscow furtherly coming into boiling water as a result of this purchase? What does that mean for each side strategically? Let's go to Mr. Courtney first.
This has primarily been an issue between the United States and Turkey rather than the United States and Russia. The United States and Turkey have a NATO alliance. That is the key issue, how the NATO alliance works. For example, with the S-400 system, the Turks could test fly the F-35 stealth fighter against it and help determine what some of the weaknesses of the F-35 are. So for that reason, the United States has said it will cut off the F-35 program for Turkey if it buys the S-400. But the United States will still try to work with Turkey on Syria, on a number of other Middle Eastern issues, and within the NATO alliance.
What about for you, Professor Lukin? For Russia, how vulnerable the bilateral relations will be if the deal continues in a way that just explained, Professor?
Well, it's certainly very good for Russian-Turkish relations because we are already cooperating on many issues, like in Syria, for example. Economic cooperation is very close, and now in arms trade. And Turkish-U.S. relations, it's not for us to decide, or even if it is for them to decide. But I can say one thing: if the United States stops selling fighter jets to Turkey, we can help and sell their own planes, and we are going to be even closer.
Mr. Çalhakoglu, is this a smart move? How smart is it for Turkey to once again put itself in the middle of two important players, the United States and Russia, and having eventually an upper hand and more stake for itself? But however, some say it's also like playing with fire. So that's really a fine balance.
So yeah, this is a very difficult situation right now for Turkey. So there was a approaching crisis for Turkey for last at least 1 year. So the Turkish government could not escape for this escalation. So now Turkey is in between two big powers for choosing or not choosing for its defense choice in that manner. So in any sense, there will be a cost for Turkey, either choosing to purchase and deploy the S-400 or cancel it. So Turkey will face some political and economic cost in any sense. In that regard, also delaying this crisis at the last moment also will be a fireback for the Turkish government. Also, this is another problem right now. So it is there is no very clear picture for Turkey how Turkey can handle this crisis without harming its relations with the United States and NATO in general. and also keeping good relationship with Russia on the others, because Turkey and Russia have close cooperation in Syria and other issues, regional security matters. And also Turkey is economically dependent on Western alliance. In this atmosphere, so there is no clear picture for that time. And also this summer has become more hot for Turkey in terms of the ambiguities in security issues, foreign policy and economy, and now domestic policies.
Right.
So everybody is waiting the final decision and further steps from the Turkish government right now.
I see. Before we go, once again, I want to go to you, Mr. Courtney. We've seen quite some drama in recent months regarding the U.S. relationship with its allies within the NATO framework. For example, Washington, the White House asking others to pay more, which the others agreed upon. However, that's certainly the way of asking is not necessarily that pleasant. And now we see further discussions about, whether Turkey will purchase from somebody else, particularly Russia, which has been regarded as quote-unquote the rival as a result of the NATO system. So what do you think of the U.S. approach to NATO right now? And will things like this for Washington to be prepared for the near future? Mr. Courtney.
The U.S. relationship with NATO is quite strong, and NATO itself has become even stronger in recent years. Some months ago, the Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, gave a speech before a joint session of the U.S. Congress, which showed the strength of bipartisan support for NATO. There's been unity in NATO on the importance of the European Deterrence Initiative in order to increase NATO's capacity in the eastern flank of NATO.
Okay.
NATO allies, some of them are increasing their support for the alliance.
I see. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic. Certainly, we're going to see what's going to happen in recent days and weeks. Thank you so much. Selçuk Kolakoglu, Alexander Lukin, William Courtney, coming from Russia, the United States, and Turkey. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. You are watching World Insight, still to come on our live program. The advent of cashless age, what do you get from the combination of a social network giant and cryptocurrency? Some answers after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, the program coming to you live on CGTN. It is the dawn of the cashless age, they say. It's the digital money that makes the world go around through mobile payments, fintech with virtual banks, and, of course, cryptocurrency. Last month, social network giant Facebook jumped on the bandwagon, unveiling a new cryptocurrency called the Libra. It's powered by a technology called blockchain, of course, but unlike the popular Bitcoin, users cannot create Libras. They can only buy it. Libra is backed by assets, so its price shouldn't fluctuate dramatically, many believe, like Bitcoin's roller coaster performance. Facebook hopes this new product will help especially those some 1.5 billion people, adults in the world, who have no access to a traditional bank. But Facebook's ambitious venture is met with more questions than excitement. On Wednesday, Chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, said Libra raises many serious concerns regarding privacy, money laundering, consumer protection, and financial stability. These concerns are shared by many governments around the world. Cryptocurrency, digital finance. We are joined by a strong panel in London. Patrick McCrory, assistant professor from King's College in London, the UK's first PhD graduate in cryptocurrencies. Good to see you. In New York, we invite Max Wolf, a professor of economics from the New School University in Beijing. Last but not least, Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. Exciting, but certainly a lot of news going back and forth about the fate of cryptocurrency, particularly Libra. What do you say, Professor Wolf, the current stage?
So we've seen an increasingly intense sort of ebb and flow of an experiment with the cryptocurrencies, and I think probably the legacy name currency doesn't really belong terribly well to the group. I think we sort of have two different things. We have a wild speculative frenzy and a series of increasingly successful and then heartbreakingly unsuccessful get-rich-quick schemes, behind which we have a real innovation in technology that will probably eventually have a pretty large effect on how value is stored and moved around. That's the blockchain. So the currencies are usually an attempt to basically self-enrich or trap people in a walled garden. Facebook's looks like a possible new business area to open up for them that would get people to sort of pre-commit to a Facebook ecosystem of spending, which would be nothing other than a huge advantage for Facebook. Still remains to be seen how it helps anyone else, but interesting experiment at a large scale.
It is a lot of layers, isn't it, Mr. McCrory? I mean, for someone who's a major in cryptocurrency, you must know about this. This is a business level of discussion. There's also a so-called security level, particularly financial security, global financial security level of discussion. Of course, there's also the issue of how governments work with businesses as well. So your take?
Well, what was the take on? Sorry.
The question is, what about the three layers of discussion? Which do you think is more important?
The layer of discussion in terms of business and money are governments.
Business, government relations. What about the global financial security situation? And what about what one business can do and its relation with the other business? You get it?
Yeah, I got you. Yeah.
Great.
So if this is in terms of Libra. Yeah.
Yes, sure.
So
that's the topic of today. If
you
know what you're being invited to, sir.
Yeah. So I think for Libra, I think what you're basically discovering is that there's 100 founding members in the world, these Western companies, that are basically trying to set up a new global currency reserve. And it's actually it's a little bit terrifying that the fact that there's going to be 100 currencies or 100 founding members who are going to be able to dictate monetary policy and take that away from national governments. Yeah, so I'm very dubious whether Libra will ever ship or be deployed.
Interesting.
So you noticed last week with the Federal Reserve in the U.S., they basically told Libra the stop implementation, just so the national governments can actually assess the situation.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Mock in Beijing?
I do. I mean, I think the key, if we're looking at it from a government perspective, is Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's phrasing that this is a marathon, not a sprint. For businesses, especially technology businesses that depend on speed of implementation, I think this is the kiss of death. And why has this happened? I think this is a misstep by Facebook in that certainly targeting 1.5 billion people who are unbanked is a good commercial business opportunity. But I think they're touching the third rail of global finance in that any country, I think, considers control of its currency, if nothing else for monetary policy to manage the economy, is crucial. And any entity, company or otherwise, that would seek to undermine that power, I think really is going to hit a brick wall.
Well, Professor Mock, Professor Wolf, there was the case that governments around the world are controlling the kinds of currency being used in their own countries, at least. And also globally, there's a basket of currencies that's likely to be most important, US dollar at the very center of it. Now, the question really is Libra, when used, and particularly getting popular all over the world, would it mean an advantage for a company like Facebook, or an advantage also for a government such as the United States, even in the field of cryptocurrency?
So those are interesting questions. It's hard to sort of answer because we haven't seen a deployment. But look, we have had experiments with private currencies. They dominated the world financial system until roughly the early part of the 20th century, until the about the turn of the last century, right? And so we experimented with various private money issuance without this technology for about 600 years, and it was mostly an unmitigated and complete and total failure because you needed a last instance guarantor. The state did that, and you needed an international set of rules, and those were variously produced by state and interstate agreements. So it's not so clear that pure greed will self-generate a regulatory system that's robust, even with the new technology. And we do have to be honest with ourselves that it was not an unbridled success under the gold standard or even the best of the pre-existing arrangements. So it's also just not theoretically possible that we'd get an international currency that there aren't national rule makings and findings on, because even if the state serves no other purpose, they still have the legal right to arrest you and put you in prison, which is pretty compelling for most real human beings making decisions.
That's making this especially interesting, isn't it, Patrick? If Facebook
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, sure. You could add something to that, but I also have a question to follow up if you can. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So my question really is, the legal framework Professor Wolf was talking about, extremely interesting because Facebook based in the United States, which means Facebook as a company has to abide by the American law. However, Facebook is doing a cryptocurrency that's supposed to be used worldwide, and therefore, which means indirectly the American rule of law and American government is controlling the fate of cryptocurrency, such as Libra, if it is being used worldwide. Do you take that, Patrick?
Yeah, so I think Facebook have actually played a very nice trick here to avoid, the U.S. government being able to stamp on it and pull it out. So Libra is actually an association or foundation in Switzerland. So it's actually being run from Switzerland in the moment and not the U.S. What the Facebook have also done is they remove liability of themselves. So when they say that when this currency launches, one point is to say that in the US, it's free speech to write code. You can write as much code as you want, and you cannot be held liable for that. But what they've done is that they're writing the code, and when you go to put the code live and deploy it, there's going to be 100 companies that are going to run the system. So all 100 companies distributed across the world are sharing the liability for this.
But
so
the 100 companies, even though as big as 100, one could argue there's always a major player among those 100, first of all. And secondly, if you look at the 100 companies vis-a-vis millions and probably billion companies around the world, it's still a very small group of companies. And therefore, also the trust issue, why should we trust these 100 companies? Just like the question, why should we trust governments as well? Patrick, if you could go ahead with some brief answers.
Yeah, so I think what's really important there to highlight is that what these corporations are pretty much doing are trying to go above nation states and governments. So what's going to happen in the future is that when so the way Libra gets its value is that there's a bucket of currencies that they've not yet decided what's going to be in there. What's going to be really remarkable is that these corporations are going to get to decide which currencies get in the basket. And how significant those currencies are on a global stage, and that's a huge financial power these 100+ founding members are going to have. I think one other point they make is that while there's going to be a major player to begin with, which is Facebook, which is pushing forward this initiative, the way the foundation is set up is that it's going to be a supermajority of these members. So you may have to get 70% of these founding members vote before a policy can be changed. So they've got some safeguards there to prevent one major player taking advantage of it.
Interesting. Andy, your take?
Well, I think that, again, I think I'm fairly skeptical about this. I think the point's made that, of course, Facebook as a corporation headquartered in the U.S. is subject to some degree to U.S. law. But also, I think Patrick's point is a good one in that these global corporations, in some sense, are able to transcend national laws, and that's one of the challenges of our times as well, especially with data, with technology that affects billions of customers around the world.
But as we also see that companies around the world, no matter how global they are very vulnerable to global trade wars, as we see every day in the headlines. So if you argue global companies could be free from all the troubles created by politics or geopolitics, it's probably too naive, is it?
Sure. Well, I say not free from the constraints of politics or geopolitics, but they do have some degree of flexibility so that if the legal regime, the regulatory regime is too onerous in the U.S., they can shift some degree out to other parts of the world. But of course, they can't completely avoid that. Yes,
right, and on the other
true.
hand, the basket of currencies, likely cryptocurrency today, likely to be issued by anybody, is still very much likely to have the U.S. dollar as the major currency in that basket, and therefore making U.S. dollar has a great advantage, and therefore any country that is having a U.S. dollar, mainly printing by the United States, also have a huge advantage as a result. So Professor Wolf, given all of those principles and likely happening phenomena explained, what do you make of the future of cryptocurrency? Once again, I want to bring out these three layers that we discussed earlier among businesses, between business and government, and also in terms of the bigger framework of security of global currencies.
So my guess is that one of two things happens. Either we see the major currencies with some possible private add-ons and purely speculative add-ons, but we see the major currencies become the crypto dollar, the crypto renminbi, and to some degree, crypto Swiss franc, what have you. Or, right, in other words, we see a sort of mashup of the more kind of techtopian vision that's been associated with crypto with the realities of the modern banking and payment system. Either that, or we see a period of relatively chaotic cryptocurrency usage in countries that have a national currency that is a burden and a fetter on their development. But and there sort of be two tiers here, and we see the dominant countries with hard currencies, or let's call them economically viable currencies, stay the course, and crypto becomes an interesting payment and database technology, which is what it is, and not so much a replacement for currencies, because what modern currencies are, they're largely digitized anyway,
right,
and they are the product of a series of rules from central governments, and I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future.
Now, we take a look at the overall situation. Okay, so Libra has been cautioned by the U.S. Governments, different branches of the governments. And also, we also know G7 is likely to do a report, likely in the middle of this month, about cryptocurrency and its impact and how governments should deal with that. Certainly, we know the IMF, particularly the managing director of IMF, have been talking repeatedly about the caution people should have toward cryptocurrency. So it seems that whether it's individual governments or international organizations or platforms are all taking different ways of looking at the fate of cryptocurrency. So given that as a reality, Patrick, where are we heading for in the near? Let's take a look at this very important near future. Patrick, go ahead.
In the near future, so I think there's one important point to mention is that Bitcoin's 10 years old now. And Bitcoin's actually is the only online digital money that's been basically online for 100% of the time, and is, open source, permissionless. Anyone can access and anyone can use it. So given this 10-year history of proven success, I don't think it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. I think what we're going to see in the near future are central banks and national governments issuing their own type of cryptocurrency. So there's already some governments or central banks. I think the Chinese central bank recently mentioned they're going to step up their efforts towards issuing their own coin. I think what you're going to see is a lot of countries issuing their own coins. You'll have Libra in the middle. That will hopefully be this regulated global reserve. I don't think it's actually ever going to ship. I'd be very dubious whether regulators ever let that ship.
Okay.
And then I think what you're going to have is something like Bitcoin or Ethereum. That's like, global programmable money. That'll be like this new trust-free financial system.
I see.
So that would be my vision.
Oh, okay. There we go. You are the first PhD. What can I say, right? Andy, go ahead. Your thoughts. Near future.
Well, I think in the near future, China is doing some very interesting things. And I want to make the distinction here between cryptocurrency and digital currency or digital money. So I think one of the things that's very interesting that we can see in the near term is China's exploring, looking at replacing cash, so the physical money, the bills and the coins, with some sort of digital
substitute, and that solves a lot of problems. It still preserves some anonymity for users, but it also gives the government a lot more transparency, better, more complete, more granular data on the economy. So I think that's one important thing that we can look for, and I would distinguish that from a cryptocurrency, but I would call that perhaps digital currency.
I see. Last but not least, Max, what do you think? Near future.
Yes, so I think we need to see a retrenchment of the notion of blockchain as currency and speculative investment vehicle, and a change for the use technology, which I think would open up some greater possibilities. But I think that a lot of the excitement around cryptocurrency has been driven by fantastic and irreproducible investment gains, which are really a testament to this era of upward wealth redistribution and loose monetary policy. And so we'll have to see that normalized before we can make an assessment outside of an unusual benchmarking situation.
I see. Good point there. All of you, great points. Certainly we learned a lot about cryptocurrency and its relations with our financial security for the future. Thank you so much, Andy Mock, Max Wolf, and Patrick McCory. Really appreciate the gentlemen. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us. World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and to everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. See you tomorrow.